Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and apologies for the mix-up on the two different training sites. Okay, so we're here, and the purpose of the training, as we all know, is how to enter a housing move-in date. So HUD has increasingly relied on accurate data to inform policy and funding decisions more and more as we've moved forward. And it's crucial that we keep our records up to date. So by ensuring that these housing moving dates are updated in HMIS, we can better support our communities and improve the services that we provide. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce our two HMIS team, people who will be running the training, and it is Kavasia and Rochelle who will be the presenters today. So take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kavasia Garrett. I'm a program coordinator here at All Chicago. My pronouns are he and him. And today, alongside my colleague Rochelle, we're going to be discussing how to document the housing movement date in HMIS. Before I get started, I'm going to pass it off to Rochelle so she can introduce herself.
Everybody, it's my name is Rochelle Fajardo. I am the training coordinator over at the HMIS team. Pronouns are she or her.
Okay, you can start it, Rochelle. So before getting started, I'd like to share the goals for this training. By the end of this training, you should understand what a housing movement date is, the importance of documenting the housing movement date in HMIS, and then how to document a housing movement date into the HMIS system. Go ahead, Rochelle. Thank you. So before I dive into the details of the housing movement date, I want to take a moment to describe the overall HMIS flow that is followed for all permanent housing enrollment in HMIS so that I can properly contextualize where the housing movement date process fits into the overall workflow. So the first two steps in the flow are about making sure that the client profile is complete and updated, and the entire household is entered and up to date. These initial steps are not tied to a specific project. That means that these first two steps would occur regardless of the project enrollment. If a client already has a fully updated profile in the system and their household doesn't need anything, then nothing needs to happen within these first two steps. Moving forward, so these next four steps are project specific, and what that means is they must be completed specifically for each project enrollment. So that just means for each project enrollment, you'll be updating the release of information for each client in the household and enroll the client and the household members into that project. And the interim updates are what we're going to be focused on today. That's why the box is in orange. Housing movement dates is a type of interim update. Interim updates are interim updates reflect events that occur while the client is enrolled in the project before entry and exit, hence the name interim. And then lastly, you're going to exit the client when they end their time in the project. Any questions before we move on? Okay. So now that we have an understanding of where the housing movement date fits into the overall HMIS workflow, we can dive into what the housing movement date is. So the housing movement date marks the first time a client resides in a permanent living situation after enrolling into an RH or PSH project. Each project enrollment should have its own housing movement date if the client has moved into permanent housing. Each project has at most one movement date. For example, if a client moves into a permanent housing and then later relocates to another unit while still enrolled into that project, the housing movement date would remain the date that they moved into the first unit. That is because the housing movement date is when they first move into the permanent housing after project entry. It's not dependent on location. Your project may need to think about how to track this data element so that it can be reliably entered into HMIS. So I want to draw focus to the graphic below. Um, these boxes show where the housing movement date is within the flow of the project enrollment. So first comes entry, then housing movement date, then exit for each project enrollment where the client moves in. Any questions before we move on? So now that we've covered what the housing movement date is, I want to draw focus to what the housing movement date is not. The housing movement date is not the start of the lease. A lease starting doesn't really mean that the client has moved in. The housing movement date is also not when the client signs the lease. A client might sign a lease, but that doesn't mean that they've necessarily moved in. And then the housing movement date is also not when the client receives the keys. A client might receive keys without moving in that day. And I want to draw focus back to what the housing movement date is by definition. The housing movement date is when a client moves into permanent housing after enrolling into an RH or PSH project. These events on the slide might happen to occur on the same day as the client moving in, but none of these dates indicate a housing move date on its own. Any questions before we move on? Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, we do have a question that has come in from the chat, which is, what if the client came from another program and that program never entered their housing date? What should happen? So I'm gonna go ahead and just attempt to answer this question, then I'll turn it over to Rochelle just to see what she thinks. But recall that the housing move-in date is project specific. So the housing move-in date is the first date that the participant moves into a permanent living situation after enrollment in your project. So the housing move-in date would still be that first date that the participant moves into or is in a permanent living situation once they've enrolled in your project. So I'm gonna let me know if that, did not answer your question, but really it is, the housing move-in date is not dependent on whether there was a housing move-in date entered for any previous projects that the participant was enrolled in.
Okay, so now let's focus on when to enter the housing movement date into HMIS. There are certain conditions that need to be met for a housing movement date to be entered. All of these conditions should be met. How, at least for the unit, should be signed, and the client should have physical access to the unit. And usually that just means that they have keys in the hand and they're able to access the unit from because they have keys in hand. And then finally, the client has stayed overnight in that unit. So when all of these things have occurred, you'll know that the housing movement date should be recorded. Any questions before we continue?
It looks like we have some raised hands. I'm gonna just encourage people right now to type their questions into the chat. And we're gonna work on getting questions answered that way. So if you all can yeah, focus on entering your or adding your questions into the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
So did you want to take a little bit to answer these, Margaret, or are you gonna answer? Sorry. I can continue.
Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and say it looks like there's a question around, does this apply to relocations? We have, I think, some ideas of what that might mean, where folks who I'm gonna take a stab at seeing if I can get a sense of like what you mean by relocation. So sometimes what happens is folks move into a unit during their after they've enrolled in the project, and then they move into another unit after having been in that previous unit. So going back to the definition of housing move-in date, the housing move-in date is the first date that the participant is living in a permanent living situation after they have enrolled in that project. So as we're thinking about relocations, that relocation, as long as they have already been living in a permanent living situation, the relocation, the relocated when they move into that relocation, that would not be the housing move-in date. The housing move-in date would be for the first time they moved into a permanent living situation after having enrolled in the project. Rochelle, would you be able to add anything to that might be important to be considering?
I think you've covered it. I noticed that there are some chat messages about previous ideas or understandings of what the housing move-in date was for whatever purposes. The purpose of our training today is to kind of reestablish this definition for the whole community. Whatever it was before, this is what HUD wants. And it is not the lease date, because as Kavasi has mentioned, that doesn't exactly mean that they have physically stayed in that unit. So if you guys are looking at this slide that we have up right now, all three should criteria should apply before the housing move-in date is established. So the lease is signed, they have access, and they have physically stayed there in that night. So I saw a question about they received the keys 1-2, but they didn't physically stay the night until 1-3. Then 1-3 is the date of the housing move-in date in your project. So doesn't matter where the unit came from or what, doesn't matter where they came from before, but like as long as they are in your project, when is the first day they slept in a permanent housing situation?
Okay. So now that we kind of have a more of an understanding of what the housing movement date is, let's go ahead and continue this part. Let's talk about why the housing movement date matters. So the most important thing to understand is that if a housing move-in date is not entered, the client appears homeless in HMIS. And with clients who are housed look homeless in HMIS, we see a lot of impacts. On a project, agency, and program level, what happens is that it looks like less people are housed than are housed, meaning that the agency is not getting credit for the great work that they're doing. And this ends up affecting the project's overall performance outcomes. So on a homeless response system level, many instances of no housing move-in date harms the performance metrics of the system. And then HUD is placing a greater emphasis on this data to measure and evaluate system performances. And they're making decisions based on these results. Any questions before we continue?
I think I'm just going to take a moment to go through some of these questions that are coming up about the housing, kind of still coming up about the housing move-in date definition. And as you know, as we're going through these questions, as more questions come up related to kind of the importance of the housing move-in date, please feel free to drop those into the chat. So we have a question around yeah, we were told that the lease date is the move-in date according to auditing purposes. Like Rochelle said, we're here to kind of set the record straight. really keep in mind, the housing move-in date is the date that the participant moves into permanent housing. So that may be the same day that the lease is starting, and it very well may not be. So we have another question around the move-in date is the lease date or the actual date the client sleeps in the unit. So yeah, just to kind of emphasize that point, the move-in date is the date that the participant moves in and takes possession of the unit. Now you know that they've moved in because they have spent the night in the unit, but the housing move-in date is that date that they are moving in. And taking possession of the unit. And we have someone stating, Annika stating, we have clients that have signed leases and received keys, but are choosing not to stay at the unit until they get furniture or for other various reasons. Are you saying that we can't enter a housing move-in date until they stay the night? So the housing move-in date, the definition of it is they have physically moved into the unit. So even if they've signed a lease, they've received the keys, you wouldn't enter the housing move-in date until they are physically staying at the unit. Okay, and I see that some of these questions are being answered in the chat. Sometimes we get a lease signed before the client moves in and we receive keys. Clients do not move into units without having furniture delivered. Yeah, so kind of a similar situation. Recall that the housing move-in date is when they are actually moving into the unit.
I just want
Yep.
to quickly address Tremaine because I fear that it keeps kind of going away. So he's saying that the client moved in on 1/2. You can record it the days after. You can record it on 1/2. You can record it 1/3. But the housing move-in date, the actual data element, should say 1/2. From your situation, the review date of the interim will be 1/3. So you're receiving the information 1/3, but the housing move-in date is still 1/2. I hope that clarifies your question. Awesome.
And we also have a question, but isn't accepting the keys taking possession of the unit? Yep, so that is one of the criteria that we would use to determine if a housing move-in date should be entered. So accepting the keys is the client having physical access to the unit. And then we would also want to ensure that a lease agreement applicable to the client is signed and the client has spent the night in the unit. Right. So it looks like I think that a lot of these questions I think are gonna continue to be clarified with Rochelle going through a little bit more about how to enter in a housing move-in date. So I think we'll move forward and see if we can kind of continue to clarify some of these questions that are coming up.
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Rochelle Fajardo. I'm training coordinator over at the HMIS side, and I'll be walking through step by step how the housing move-in date must be documented in HMIS. Now that we've fully understood or have started to understand at least the definition, the criteria of what it means to have a housing move-in date. So we're going to go back to this chart that was beautifully created of the HMIS flow just to kind of, again, orient ourselves. And then at the same time, I'm also going to do that with a client on the training site. So we have more of a contextualized idea of what it really means of like where this fits into your HMIS flow. So I have the test client here. Well, we'll start from the very beginning. So the very first step is to search and create and update the client profile itself and their household. So as we've mentioned, this is not project specific, but it should be a review that's done for each client that you're working with in the HMIS. So always search for clients first. Our client's name is going to be Sandy Test. And we want to make sure you are actually editing the right client profile by kind of reviewing the social security number is the best one to use as a tool, or like their date of birth. So once we get to our client record, just want to make sure that the information that they provide with the client record is accurate to what you have. Always just make sure that their profile is correct before we do anything. And want to make sure that they are in a household that includes the people that you're working with. Households are really important because they link clients together that are being serviced together, and this has to be established before they enroll, because after you enroll them, you can't add a household. So just be very, that's why this is the very beginning of kind of your workflow, is to make sure all of those things are correct. So once you enter data, it is being associated with the right people. The next step would be to make sure that they have an updated ROI in the system that is valid for that day that you are working with them. Every time you do an enrollment for your project, there should be consent forms obtained from your clients and documented in the system, and make sure that they are still within, that they're still valid at that time. The next step would be to make sure that you have an enrollment into your project. So all enrollments are within one row of this table, whether you're looking at it in the summary section or in the entry exit. Anything associated with your project will be in this row, this project enrollment row. So if I add a new one, that creates a brand new record clear of anything. So want to make sure that we are working with the same row, so that it is, again, linking all those things. You're linking your client to your project and that episode and that event of them being enrolled into your project. And then where we're going to be living today is the interim update. As we mentioned, that is all the events that's happening from the time they've started working with you to the time that they have stopped, which is our exit, is going to be at the end. So our interims live here in this first notepad. And then that's where we're going to be focusing our time today. So, window. So again, kind of another refresher. So our housing move-in date must be entered for every project enrollment. So if there are multiple project enrollments, there's one for each one. And as we've mentioned, it is the first day that they are physically in a permanent housing situation while enrolled in your project. Not dependent on anybody else's project, just your project. Okay. So it has to be on or after the project start date. So they have to be already enrolled in your project, and they could move in on the same day, but it needs to be on or after. And then again, on or before they stopped working with you, which is the project exit date. So to zoom in to our housing move-in date process, again, first step is going to be orienting ourselves into the project enrollment. We're going to add an interim review with a review date, add and enter the housing move-in date, and then save the record and then document it for other household members. So that first step is to orient ourselves. So again, we're going to navigate to that entry exit tab that which we're already at, locate the relevant rapid rehousing or PSH enrollment, and create the enrollment if it's not there. So like, as I mentioned, this is our enrollment. We're going to add an interim review so that our interims live right here. You would normally just add it, And then the review date is going to be the housing move-in date. So make sure that is selected so that the system kind of pulls it in, that tells them there is a housing move-in date that was entered on this day. That's all it's telling the system. Save and continue. Okay. Oh, so want to make sure that that review date is when the information you receive. So maybe they moved in yesterday, they didn't tell you until today that they physically slept there, but today is the day you receive that information. That is your review date. This date must be on or after that start date as well. So if you can see here, our start date is 7/19. Our review date is 7/20. My review date can also be the same day again, but as long as it is on or after that project start date. The next step is to enter the housing move-in date. So once I enter the review type and add the review date, I'm going to click save and continue. And you want to make sure that you are in the HUD COC update assessment. So some folks, some projects is probably set up to go to a rapid rehousing assessment automatically. So you want to make sure that you are navigating to the HUD COC update assessment. It's going to be what's lit up. If you're not sure what's assessment you're in, at the very top of this table, it does indicate what assessment you are in. And to really make sure, the very first thing you'll see is the very first question you'll see is the housing move-in date question. Okay. If you do not see this question, you have not entered a housing move-in date. This question is what all the reports are looking for. This question is where the housing move-in date is entered. So that is actually the next step. So once you are in the right assessment, you must enter the date they have first physically stayed in their unit on this element here. So the date is here. Again, this can be the same day as the review date. It can be the day before the review date, but it needs to still align with that project start date as long as it's within our enrollment. I'm going to pause right there and see if anything comes up regarding those steps. Housing type usually will be rental by client with ongoing subsidy. That's where rapid rehousing and PSH falls under in HUD's list. So, and then in the rest of the interim review, if there's any other changes that you've learned since they first enrolled, which in this case was just yesterday, so if anything changed, like domestic violence or their disability or any type of sub-assessment data, you can also add that update in the same assessment. I'm not going to go over any of that, but after you've entered your housing move-in date, we're going to go down, click save. Right? And then if there are other household members, which in our case here, we have Patrick with Sandy, I can just navigate to their assessment by clicking this tab here. They also need a housing move-in date entered. Make sure you are also entering that housing move-in date. Whenever they move in, could be the same day. It doesn't have to be the same day. Sometimes people move in on different days. But it still needs to be entered. Now, if they did not enter on the same day, then I would have to navigate to Patrick's, create an interim review, and follow the same process for whenever I receive the information that they have then moved in. That is all the steps, right? So we have added the housing move-in date to each household member. So each household member must have their own housing move-in date entered. We're allowed to have different housing move-in dates for each. Repeat until all have been updated. Any questions? That is the basics on how to enter the housing move-in date. So a few things now that we have kind of walked through what that looks like, let's kind of see where our understanding is at. So we're going to set up just a simple little scenario. We've got a client enrolled in Project A on October 1st, moved in the apartment November 6th. Information was verified by staff on November 8th. Since we're in the chat, can I just have some people let me know what date out of these would we enter as the housing move-in date? What is our housing move-in date? Give you guys a few minutes. Make sure everyone's awake. Awesome. Yes, we moved in on November 6th. November 8th will be our review date when we enter it into the system. That's gonna be our review date. Once you enter the assessment itself, we'll be entering 11/6/2024. Awesome. Now something a little bit more complex. Thank you guys for participating. Our next scenario, we've got Sandy, okay, who initially moved into an apartment under a previous rapid rehousing project A on July 20th and continues to reside in that same apartment. Sandy had transitioned from a different rapid rehousing project that had concluded its contract. So we actually just looking at Sandy's record just a second ago. So they're set up in there. And according to our new scenario, that project's contract has ended and now they need to move to a different project. So what will need to happen since they have now concluded their services in this project on October 15th, they need to be exited in the old project. So I'm in project A, I will need to create an exit for Sandy and Patrick for the day that their contract concluded and stopped working with that project, October 15th. Leaving program, destination, we're staying in that rental. Save and continue. So we're just creating a record for an exit. Update it if you need, save and exit. So as a case manager for Project B, you enrolled Sandy in rapid rehousing on October 15th. So all we're doing is transferring them over. So add entry exit, include my household members, looking for a different rapid rehousing project. Let's go to Bogan. HUD, and then again, project start date is October 15, 2024. Complete. Oh, I can't really use this because it's not operational, so we don't have any assessments in there. So then I would complete the entry assessment as if I'm in project B. I'm going to click save and exit here. Our main purpose right now is the housing move-in date. So now to enter the housing move-in date. So since this Sandy is coming in already moved in, then the first day that they have stayed in a permanent housing is the day that I'm servicing them. So that will also be the same day as my housing move-in date. So enter interim, housing move-in date. It is still 10/15/2024. Save and continue. So that is allowed because it is the same day on or after my project start date. In my assessment, want to make sure that I am in the update assessment. So this particular project takes me to annual assessment first. You notice that the housing move-in date is not the first question. So look for the update assessment at the top. in. Update assessment now. Very first question is housing move-in date. The old housing move-in date might populate in there, but we know that I am now entering data for project B. So my new housing move-in date is 10/15. Okay. Enter any data I need, click save. Assuming that Patrick did not move out when the project transitioned, I now need to go to Patrick. Again, the old housing move-in date sometimes will populate. Change it to our new housing move-in date. Go down and save and exit. I see a question in the chat. So basically the housing move-in date is the date when she switched projects. Yeah, so again, like at the very basic level, at the foundation, it is the first date that they are in, they have stayed in that permanent housing situation within your enrollment. So since she was already in the unit when she moved in, that is the first day that that is the housing move-in date. Any other questions about Sandy's scenario here?
Just to add to that, if you have the housing move-in date as a date that is before the entry date into your project, that housing move-in date will be invalid. So it will not count as a housing move-in date for your project.
So what is the housing move-in date? October 15th. This is the first date the client has stayed in a unit after they were enrolled in the rapid rehousing project. Right. And then scenario 3, a client in your project moved into an apartment on September 1st. You updated the housing move-in date, and then on October 17th, they moved into a different housing unit with no days of homelessness in between. Anyone like to take a stab at how would I update that into the system, if at all? If at all. Is their housing move-in date? Great. I love that there is a variety of answers. The correct answer is no change. The original housing move-in date is still valid. They have not changed projects. They just changed housing units. So they are still on permanent housing. So no new interim needs to be made. No update is needed. So if this happens, as a reminder, there is only one housing move-in date. So once you have entered it, unless you stop servicing them or stop servicing the unit for any reason, that is the only date, only housing move-in date for your project. So essentially, they would need to be exited to get a new housing move-in date. But once they are in that enrollment, that housing move-in date stays the same. And then we've just got some resources. I will drop the article in the chat shortly. We'll also share it with all the other stuff that we'll share later. But if there are other questions, we might be able to, we have some time to facilitate more questions if there are. All for our presentation today, though. I do still see a couple hands that are raised. Are we allowing folks to unmute, or are folks wanting to unmute and continue to chat? Yep, the slides will be available. We will post it in LMS, and the help desk will post any and all resources. Move out from the date move in. Usually when they have moved out is when you're exiting them from the project. So they stay enrolled, and that move-in date stays valid until they move out, or the project stops servicing the client in general. It's not the same as the housing move-in dates. If they're moving out, you're exiting them from the project completely. So that would look like this exit date here. So again, there's only one housing move-in date when they stop being serviced by that project, or if they move out, you are then exiting them from the project completely. But that's a different webinar.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just as far as the rapid rehousing project and people moving out of units, I would say that that would be a situation to be working kind of more on a case by case basis with the HMIS team to figure out kind of like how to handle that specifically. And as far as, you know, like exiting participants, you know, that would be, I think, something to be talking about with uh within your project staff and the folks supporting you at All Chicago, to be identifying sort of how that works. Other questions?
Dropped in the chat the article from the help desk and our help desk ticketing system. So if there are more specific cases that you guys like to talk through and to understand what date is what, please feel free to send us a ticket, and then we can kind of walk through case by case in that way. Since there doesn't seem to be any questions, we can close out, but I'll be hanging out here until the end of our time, but just want to release folks if they want. Is that okay?